Fine. Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, to the University of New York, MEC. This is our office hour and lecture. As always, we will begin with lecture, and at the conclusion of the lecture, I will turn off the video for Q&A, and then continue with office hour matters as required. Today, of course, is Tuesday, September 30th, 2025. And last week, we began a three-part study of the three theoretical perspectives of global trade. And just to reiterate, the three major perspectives include the liberal perspective, which we covered last week, the realistic perspective, which we will cover, or we are covering this week, and historical materialism, which we will cover next week. This week's lecture will emphasize power and national interest, which is really what realism or the realistic perspective focuses on. So put differently, you could say that realism emphasizes power and national interest and directs more attention to political security than economic issues. First, realism is the oldest thought in international relations. Second, realism is currently a consequential IPE perspective for two critical reasons. First, the global order is currently challenged with two seemingly intractable conflicts: Russia's military conflict in Ukraine and Israel's military conflict in the West Bank and Gaza. These two conflicts have demonstrable characteristics of realism, as their strategic objectives are the maximization of power and national interest, while directing more attention to political security rather than economic issues. Clearly, neither Russia nor Israel has been economically advantaged by these or either of these conflicts. I should note, though, that in the last few days, President Trump has met with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and there appears to be a framework for ceasefire. And as is being reported, the holdup is to hear if the Palestinians think that the terms are favorable enough for them. But again, these are this conflict, and of course the Russian war in Ukraine are the two intractable conflicts, the two major intractable conflicts. There are others, of course, like the Rohingya challenges that continue to occur in Southeast Asia and the Sudan war, among many others. The second critical reason why realism is currently a consequential IPE or international political economy perspective is a perceived decline of US economic hegemony vis-a-vis emerging powers such as China, and about the relative merit of government involvement in the market. Again, the liberal order would say the markets, that the government should not interfere with the market significantly, and that the international institutions would arbitrate disputes between nations, among others. The realistic perspective, of course, sees the nation state as leading the agenda. So the critical reason realism is a consequential IPE perspective currently, as I said, is a perceived decline of US economic hegemony vis-a-vis emerging powers such as China, and about the relative merits of government involvement in the market. this last sentence, the relative merits of government involvement in the market. We're going to unpack this just very briefly. These issues have become even more pressing due to the ongoing heightened debate on US tariffs, again, government involvement in the market. Furthermore, this increased involvement by government in the market is also at the foundation of the debate over geopolitical competition. And it's not just the United States, to be clear, because we mentioned tariffs. China's reliance on what many of its trading partners consider non-market economic practices, or NME, it is textbook example of emphasis on maximization of power and national interest. With respect to non-market economic practices, China's international trading partners argue that many of China's exports do not operate on market principles of cost and pricing structures. And as such, these exports do not reflect the fair value of the merchandise. China's trading partners further argue that China's state subsidies, especially on export products, lead to non-market economic practices, which causes misalignment between price and production cost in the global economy. And this impairs the efficient operation of the free market system. So again, China's trading partners further argue that China's state subsidies, especially on export products, leads to non-market economic practices, which causes misalignment between price and production cost, i.e. subsidy, in the global economy. And this impairs the efficient operation of the free market system. Essentially, if it costs everybody in the market just about, say, and again, this is just for clarity and as an example, if it costs everybody in the market just about $10,000 to produce a car, it means that realistically, you're going to need to sell that car at 10,000 plus 1 penny at least, or $1 at least, right? Because you got to turn a profit. But it gets even more complicated than that because you got to cover the cost of capital. You're going to have to cover the cost of shipping the car. And if you've ever purchased a new car, you will realize that transporting the car to your dealership is also an additional cost. But what happens if in one country, this $10,000 for producing the car is subsidized by the government? Let's say the government said, this is again, keeping it overly simple. Let's say the government says to the car manufacturer in that country, of the 10,000 it would cost you to manufacture each car, I would give you $5,000. So this means that effectively the cost, while the cost of manufacturing for all other countries is $10,000 per car, for this country X that the government gives a subsidy of $5,000 per, the effective cost for producing the car is $5,000. That means theoretically that manufacturer can go to the international market and sell the cars at 5,000 plus $1, while others are forced to sell at least at $10,001. Of course, if you're a consumer, this seemingly is a good deal for you because now you're paying $5,001 for a car instead of $10,001 for a car. But if you were to zoom out a little bit more broadly, you will quickly realize that this, all things being equal, this misalignment between price and production cost would quickly cause many of the car manufacturers in all these other countries to begin to go under, or at least be under severe financial pressure. I mean, there are a number of things they can do. They can begin to try to differentiate their products on luxury or quality. But there is only a finite number of people who buy luxury products. Most people just want an efficient and reliable car. Now, if you were to zoom out a little bit further away again, you would quickly realize that as those car companies begin to shudder and the supply chain for manufacturing these cars will begin to shudder too, these unemployed people will begin to take their children away from the schools, private schools. Maybe the kids were in private schools because they made money and they can afford it. But now they are going to need to take the children out of the private school. Now, the teacher in that private school could be the potential customer for this $5,001 car that is imported because of subsidy. Again, remember, the car is only $5,001. However, because most of the parents are getting on, many of the parents in their school are getting unemployed, this and therefore pulling their students out of the school, private school, and taking them into public school. Those teachers might actually, some of them might end up getting laid off. That means although 5,000 plus $1 is a great deal for a car, they're not going to be able to purchase it because they no longer have job security. So you could see how it could lead to a zero-sum game and an eventual decline of all economies. Because even for the country that is subsidizing the car, they're going to end up selling less cars because the inefficiency in their price and production system has so decimated other markets and with it their potential customers that they're going to have cheap cars that barely anybody is going to be able to afford. Again, this is an oversimplification of the economic consequence of a misalignment between prices and production costs. As you will recall, we had in a previous class discussed the theory of comparative advantage, which is the ability of a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. But clearly, that is not what's going on here in the example that I gave. So comparative advantage is therefore a key economic principle that explains why countries can benefit from trade. So comparative advantage is such that you have universities that own patents, and those patents are leased to the local car manufacturer. Those universities that own patents also train some of the best technicians who build some of the best cars, right? And this sets up an automobile ecosystem within that economy. That economy can be said to have a comparative advantage. However, a misalignment between prices and production due to non-market economic practices or NME can unduly advantage a country over its trading partners and worse, distort efficiency of markets and create economic inefficiencies in the global trading system, which I had just explained in broad strokes. Of note, two major strains of realism are relevant to the study of international political economy. The first strain, which largely neglects economics, sees little connection between economics and politics. The second strain of realism is more attuned to economic political linkages. Now, here are the learning objectives for this week. And this means that at the conclusion of this week's module, you will be able to respond to the following questions. The first is, explain the realistic view of international relations, to which I will say, realists view international relations from a competitive and conflictual perspective. It is usually contrasted with idealism of liberalism, which tends to emphasize cooperation. Not all realists, however, deny the presence of ethics in international relations. Accordingly, a distinction should be drawn between classical realism, represented by such 20th century theorists as Reinhold Niebuhr and Hans Morgenthau, and radical or extreme realism. While classical realism emphasizes the concept of national interest, it is not the Machiavellian doctrine that anything is justified by reason of state, nor does it involve the glorification. That is, classic realism does not involve the glorification of war or conflict. Classic realists do not reject the possibility of moral judgment in international politics. Rather, they are critical of moralism that does not take into account political realities. Realists believe that sovereign states are the principal actors in the international system. By this measure, international institutions, non-governmental organizations, and multilateral corporations, individuals, and other sub-state and non-state actors are viewed as having little independent influence. So it is all about the state, in other words. Realists believe that there are no universal principles with which all states may guide their actions. Of course, this universal principle is the abiding and guiding principle of the liberal order, or the rules-based international order, which of course is what we covered last week, the international political economy and international relations perspective that we covered last week. So realists believe that there are no universal principles with which all states may guide their actions. Instead, a state, according to realists, must always be aware of the actions of the states around it and must use a pragmatic approach to resolve problems as they arise. A lack of certainty regarding intentions prompts mistrust and competition between states. And that's one shortcoming. And we will unpack this at the tail end of the class. However, realism is often criticized as excessively pessimistic, since it sees the confrontational nature of the international system as inevitable. Again, I kind of take a middle road. While the confrontational nature may not be inevitable, may not be inevitable, conflict and confrontation doesn't always have to lead to conflict. And that's what the rules-based international system attempts to do, which is create institutions and norms of behavior that can guide and constrain the actors, nation states, and also provide a dispute resolution mechanism. That's inherent in the evolution of GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, to the World Trade Organization, and also the evolution from League of Nations to the United Nations. The second learning objective is to describe the origins and philosophical foundation of the realistic point of view in international relations, to which I would say, among its founding fathers, Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Hobbes are the names most usually mentioned as the core founding fathers of the realistic perspective in international relations. 20th century classical realism has today been largely replaced by neo-realism, which is an attempt to construct a more scientific approach to the study of international relations. Both classical realism and neorealism have been subjected to criticism from international relations theorists, especially those who represent the liberal, critical, and postmodern perspectives. No surprise there. The third learning objective for the week is to be able to explain how realism is connected to economic relations and conflicts in global trade. To which I would say that realists see the state as motivated by power, principally. With respect to trade, realists reiterate Mercantilist philosophies, viewing economic statecraft, including trade policies, as one of the many instruments available to the state in their pursuit of power and or national security. For realists, trade relationships are temporary. These transitory arrangements that can be easily broken when conditions necessitate other strategies to secure national interest. So at the core of it is a national interest. Realists do not rule out the utility of force, even against a trade partner, when national interests are at risk, at stake. However, force may be undesirable when the trading partner is vital to national interest. So the undesirability of violence in this case is not based on the morality of a liberal order. It is based on core national interest. Lastly, realists are less optimistic about human nature. They envisage conflict rather than cooperation or the common good. So they envision that because of the optimistic view, they envision that it's more likely there will be conflict rather than common good resulting from self-interested actions. And this is really, really the core shortcoming, in my opinion, of the realistic perspective. So I would say that this is the fatal flaw in the logic and incentive structure of the realistic perspective. And let me explain very briefly. This flaw is known as a security dilemma, aka the spiral model. It is best explained by Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And this leads to a vicious cycle that nobody truly wants. Realize, for instance, in the case, just citing as an example, Russia's war on Ukraine. I very much doubt that the strategic intent for the Russian state is to deplete their economy, have its transition to a war economy, have thousands, if not tens of thousands of the youngsters die on the battlefield, and have their president indicted by the International Criminal Justice System. I can't imagine that is their strategic objective. But as Newton's third law of motion states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So here is the reaction. Europeans have enjoyed peace and prosperity, unlike that has never not existed in recorded history. And they've enjoyed this since the New World Order post Second World War II. One of the core tenets of the liberal order is that no nation shall, through the barrel of a gun, withdraw national borders, because that's kind of what started so many wars in Europe. And now that they see Russia trying to do that and has been on the course of doing that over the last decade and a half or so, especially in Ukraine, there is a unification against Russia's actions. Finland and one of the Nordic, another Nordic country, I forget which one exactly right now, has joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This cannot be what Russia wants. Actually, is explicitly against Russia's deep concerns, which is the eastward expansion of NATO. But what they have now created as an equal and opposite reaction is an acceleration of the eastward expansion of NATO and the expansion of NATO's land border against Russia. So, with this logic in mind, consider that as each state pursues its national interest, economic power and security maximization, their pursuit produces a security dilemma as other states adopt countermeasures driven by concerns for their own security and economic interest, which is what the rest of Europe is how the rest of Europe is reacting to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, typically. Consequently, security increasing measures by a state can result in greater tension. As I've just explained, the expansion of NATO, the increase in Russia's direct border against NATO countries. Russia's incursion is resulting in greater tension and escalation as demonstrated by drones that are now frequently violating the airspace of NATO countries. Many have attributed those drone incursions to Russia. Or perhaps, and worse, this could lead to conflict within the state insecurity and intensify threat to interstate commerce and peace. Nobody wants this. This is not the outcome Russia sought, I have to imagine. And this is not the outcome that the European Union and NATO countries would prefer. But again, the core challenge is that in a realistic perspective, security increasing measures by a state can result in greater tension, escalation, or conflict with insecurity and intensified threats to interstate commerce and peace. Therefore, producing an outcome which no party truly desires, thus resulting in a political instance of the prisoner's dilemma. So each state would be better off if they were simply to cooperate. And that cooperation, again, is the liberal order. The rules-based international system gets states to an optimal position. You could take this argument and it would fit neatly to the argument against tariffs, which of course is why the world realized that it was better to transition from the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, otherwise known as GATT, to WTO that has a more robust trade facilitation and trade conflict resolution mechanism. For one, unlike GATT, the WTO also covers intellectual property. Secondly, and just as crucial, the WTO has a more robust, some will say, as given recent events, that is not robust enough. But even so, it has a more robust conflict resolution mechanism than GATT. In fact, many argue that GATT is simply an agreement that pretended to be an international institution. So, instructively, Long-term mitigation measures for intensified threats to interstate commerce and security will require a rules-based international order. And this will bring the international political economy full circle to the liberal perspective, with its attendant institutions and rules to guide behavior of nation states and a forum to mediate conflict. Let me repeat, instructively, rules, long-term mitigation measures for intensified threats to interstate commerce and security will require a rules-based international order. And this will bring the international political economy full circle to the liberal perspective, with its attendant institutions and rules to guide behavior of nation states, and a forum or forums to mediate conflict. And with that, this concludes the formal section of this week's lecture. Kindly note that next week we will cover the critical perspective in the international political economy. And with that, I would end the video, and I'll stop the recording, and then we can get into Q&A and other housekeeping matters as necessary. Thank you.